I'm Jeff Fritz with SoundStage.com, and I'm joined today by Peter Comeau. He is the Director of Acoustic Design for the IAG Group. Peter, how are you today?
I'm fine. It's good to meet you.
It's good to meet you too, and I really appreciate you joining me today to talk a little bit about loudspeakers, and which I know you have a wealth of experience and quite the background, kind of reading up on your career a little bit before this interview. Can you just give us an introduction to you and tell us a little bit about your history in designing loudspeakers?
Okay. It goes back a long way. It goes back 50 years or more. But I suppose the whole hi-fi genre really got under my skin as a teenager. I built my own kit loudspeakers, and really my interest in loudspeakers grew from there. I went up to London and worked for a variety of retailers up there. That was a good groundbreaking exercise. Then managed a shop down in my home county in the southwest of England. And through that shop, I realized that there was a gap in the market. There was no quality loudspeaker within what was then still, I would say, a medium price range of about 129 to 175 pounds. I think then it would probably have been around 180 to 250 US dollars, something like that. And together with a friend who was, he sort of provoked me by saying, what can I buy that costs around that? And we couldn't find anything that satisfied him. We sort of said, well, if there isn't anything, then why don't we design something? And that set us on an 18-month design exercise where really I had to relearn everything that I thought I knew about loudspeakers, which started off, by the way, by reading Gilbert Brink's books on loudspeakers. But when you get into the reality of design, you find that the technical stuff that's written up in textbooks doesn't necessarily work out as well as that in practice. Anyway, we started a company. The brand name was Haybrook, and we had a pretty good hit with our first product, the Haybrook HB2, followed by a bigger speaker, the HB3. But the real breakthrough was the HB1, which won multiple awards throughout the world and really set us on the map as far as a brand goes. I sold out of that business after about 15 years. Went back into journalism. I'd previously worked in journalism whilst working in retail, and it was about the point when I first went into journalism in 1978 that I became aware of Mission, and so I kept contact with Mission over the years, and they invited me to go and design for them in about 1999. So I started with Mission then, worked again on award-winning speakers for Mission, and here I am today working with 6 brands under the IAG Group, which is great fun.
Yeah, and you seem to have your hands full, with design there at the IAG Group, with the wealth of products that come under that brand or that company's umbrella. Well, I want to focus in a little bit about Mission, and Mission has got quite the history in the UK. Tell us a little bit about Mission loudspeakers in general, and your work there with Mission currently.
Well, Mission originally was started by Farid Azima in 1977. He'd previously been a distributor, funnily enough, for American loudspeakers like KLH. And he decided that he could join the fray of UK loudspeaker manufacturers with his contacts in the industry, and also, obviously, having been a distributor, he had good contacts with retailers in the UK. So he started Mission loudspeakers in 1977, and then in 78 launched the Mission 770. Which set certainly the British world alight for quality monitor class loudspeakers that weren't overly expensive. And then he brought his brother in. Together they developed the Mission 700. And that set the trend really for affordable high-performance loudspeakers coming out of the Mission Group. So when I joined in 1999, they were already a very well-established manufacturer globally, selling very well into the US and Canada as well as into the rest of the world. And I think I still see on Facebook today and in the forums people cropping up saying, "Oh, I still love my Mission loudspeakers."
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that. When I was doing a little bit of research for the interview, and we're going to dive into the 770 a little bit, that's exactly what I found. I found so many cool little stories and photos of the 770, and people inheriting that loudspeaker, and maybe refurbishing it. And I learned a little bit about it. I learned that it had a polypropylene woofer that was clear. And I learned that it was a fairly large, I guess you would call it a stand mount, but it was almost a cross between a floor stander and a stand mount. It was a large stand mount, two-way. And but there was just so much information out there and so many fans of that product. And that really brings us to today. I understand that there's going to be a relaunch of the 770 coming pretty soon, and I'm guessing that that's your baby. And I wanted to learn a little bit about the new 770. What can you tell us about it?
Well, I'd like to start off with its history because it's the reason why we're doing this. In 1978, I was just working on the first Haybrook product, but I was also writing for Hi-Fi Answers magazine in the UK, amongst others. And the editor of Hi-Fi Answers, Paul Benson, based in London, obviously, was an acquaintance, like I think every magazine editor was, with Farid Azima of Mission, because he got around. He made sure that he had good contacts with the journalists, and so I used to come up and visit Paul to discuss things that were going to go in Hi-Fi Answers magazine, and Paul would be sitting there rapping his knees to songs of swing played over these prototype loudspeakers. So I was naturally interested in what this was, because they did sound really, really good, really enticing, attractive sounding loudspeakers. And it turned out to be the prototypes of the Mission 770s. So that's when I first met Farid, and he involved me as well as other journalists in the development of the 770, really as sounding boards, really as, I've just done this crossover. What do you think of this? I've just done this modification to the port. How do you think that works? And so on. And really, by the time the loudspeaker actually went into production, I, along with a lot of other journalists, were enamored by these speakers. They were one of the first loudspeakers, I would say, in the new subjective appraisal of equipment performance. It's something that I'd been doing. The reason I was writing for magazines was because I came from a background of dealing with customers in retail where everything was about the music. It wasn't about the equipment, it was about the music. That's what I turned people onto. And yet the magazines in the early and mid-70s were still focusing on measured performance above subjective performance. So I and a few other journalists in the UK wanted to turn that on its head and basically say, no, the measured performance is important as a way of checking the capability of the designer, but it really doesn't reveal the sound of a loudspeaker, for example. And we should be listening more and measuring less. So that's what we were doing in the press. And then when Farid worked on the 770 in much the same way, so he'd done the background measurements. He'd got a BBC engineer to help him with that. But the basics were, let's try this out, and what makes this sound better, and why, if I change this capacitor to this value, do I get more excited about the Mark Knopfler's guitar, for example. It was really exciting to be involved in that early product. So having worked with Mission at IAG, we then started looking at the interest that there was still in what I would call retro mission products. Should we be doing something like a large stand mount, as you pointed out, rather than just floor standers? And the general answer from the market was yes, there was still a lot of interest in this. So I said, okay, the obvious thing to do is to take the genesis of the 770 and see what we can do with modern materials. Because I always wanted, as Farad did, to take the 770 a bit further. I mean, one of the things that you'll read about if you look at the history of the 770 was the way that the 770 progressed. It went through, I think, 5 major revisions in its lifetime. But even in the Mark I format, Farad was forever tinkering with the crossover. And retailers used to get really annoyed that every pair that came in sounded different to the last. And Farad said it himself in an interview. He said, I couldn't leave it alone. It was my baby, you know. So I thought, well, the basis of that, first of all, I'd like to look at the design in detail and figure out what it was that excited me and others so much. And also to pick that up, knowing what I knew now about crossover design and loudspeaker design and cabinet design and port design and all the other things that go into a loudspeaker, and see how we can pick up where Farad left off and turn it into something which is suitable for modern recordings. Because obviously loudspeakers that were designed in the late 70s were designed with vinyl in mind. Or at the very best, reel-to-reel tape, but it was really vinyl. So if you look at the performance of, as I frequently do, because I've still got my own Haybrook designs from that age, if you look at the performance, it's really all about lifting the bass a little bit and lifting the treble quite a lot, because these are the areas that vinyl lacks. And if you subject them to modern recordings, which of course have a much wider bandwidth now, then they tend to sound a bit too boomy at the bottom end and a bit too tizzy at the top end. So we can now, I think, do a better job. So we went back, had a thorough investigation of the 770 as it originally was, and I'm about to write that up actually as a project, the 770 rediscovered, if you like. I looked very carefully at what he'd done with the drive units and with the crossover and with the cabinet, and then we set about doing all those things, but doing it better with the materials and technologies that we've got at our disposal now.
Well, you know, it is interesting what you said about dealers becoming upset because the speakers would sound different in various iterations, because that's exactly what I saw online as well. There were some folks and they were asking, well, what version of the 770 do you have? And one of the guys just answered, well, that really just all depends on how you define version, right? Because they were always changing, and there was not necessarily nomenclature on the cabinet that indicated which version you had. So well, take us into the modern design of the new 770. What did you feel specifically that you could improve in the original design, in the modern one? And do you feel like you were successful? I'm assuming that you've got at least a pretty far along prototype that you're listening to right now.
Yeah, well, I'll just shift the camera a bit. I hope that you can pick this up.
Oh wow! Okay.
That is a modern 770.
Wow.
And people who know the original will immediately recognize it. You know, we haven't strayed too far from the original industrial design, because with its white baffle and its polypropylene cone, it's quite a striking object.
Fantastic.
But the first thing that you'll see, which you mentioned, is that the original had a clear polypropylene cone. Later ones had a black polypropylene cone, which was mineral filled. In this case, we've investigated the best mineral filling that we can use for this type of polypropylene cone in order to give us an extended response up to 3 kilohertz. But also this one gives us extra rigidity in the cone. So the bass isn't, if you like, as floppy as it was before. It's much better defined now, which, as I was saying, you know, when you've got recordings of higher bandwidth, you need that. The second thing is the treble unit. The original used a CS treble unit, which was a little bit sharp, I think some people would describe it as at some frequencies. With this one, we've used a 28 millimeter silk dome. Mission have been using a silk dome now for some time, and we've got that working into a back chamber so that we've got a very low resonant frequency from it. And again, that's to extend the bandwidth downwards. Now, once we've done both those things, once we've got a very wide bandwidth for the bass unit and a very wide bandwidth for the treble unit, then we can start to work on a crossover where the drive units don't limit us in what we're going to do with the crossover. Now, I had a look at the sort of crossover that Farad was originally using, and it has a very unusual slope to it. It's not a standard Butterworth or a Linkwitz-Riley or anything like that. So having experimented with I usually like to work with Linkwitz-Riley crossovers, actually. I find them very, you can easily get a good starting response with those in modern loudspeakers. But having done that for this design, I quickly realized that it didn't give me the elements that were in the original 770. So I modeled the crossover that Farad had originally done, because remember that he'd done it using a bit of measurement, a lot of listening. And he probably wouldn't have been aware of the slope that he'd achieved. But even so, you can replicate it using modern software. So I started with that slope, and I then spent the past 9 months doing what Farad did and going back and actually listening and tweaking and listening and tweaking and just relying on the music to guide me. Other technical aspects, the original 770 was made in the BBC tradition of a thin-walled cabinet, thin-walled chipboard cabinet, heavily damped with mass bitumastic pads. So it was the original BBC idea of you lower the resonant frequency of the panels into the bass regions so they don't interfere with the mid-range. Again, that's fine as far as it went back there for vinyl, but with synth bass, direct injected bass, guitar, and so on, now you can't get away with that anymore. Your bass has got to be a lot cleaner. So what we've done in this cabinet is we've still used chipboard. We've also used an outer skin of MDF, and then the two are combined with a damping layer. So in between the two, we've got a very good damping layer. It means that we control panel resonance that way. And then internally, we've got a certain amount of bracing for the front baffle, which wasn't there in the original. That's just to stiffen the front baffle up in its weakest places, which are between the drive units, for example. Then the other thing we've done is there was a very simple cardboard port on the original 770. Again, that wasn't a bother for vinyl, because at the low frequencies it was tuned to below 40 hertz. There wasn't that much energy from vinyl down there. So the distortion that the port introduced wasn't that audible, but it is now. So again, we've done a lot of work on this particular port design, which is new for me anyway. It's a very, what I would call a hyperbolic flare, and it's flared both inside and outside the cabinet. And there is a baffle inside the cabinet replicating the baffle on the outside of the cabinet. Now, the advantages that gives us a twofold. One is unbelievably low distortion. I mean, you just won't hear any distortion from this port. And the other is that there is no sound coming from the inside of the cabinet out through the port. This particular flare blocks that normal mid-range sound which you often get from straight ports, so that we can have the port on the front of the loudspeaker without any worry about distortion or coloration from sound from inside the cabinet.
Well, it seems like a fantastic balancing act between adhering to the principles and the gestalt of the original design, if you will, with modern loudspeaker engineering and improving every aspect that was good and making it that much better. And what would be interesting to me, and maybe we can revisit this in a year or two, is how many of the owners of the original 770 are going to buy the reissue and then have them there side by side and be able to hear the differences. That would be fascinating. Well, Peter, one last question for you before I let you go. And I guess it really is the most important question of the day. What do you hear when you listen to the new 770?
Well, I hear the excitement and detailing in the mid-band that I heard in the original 770. All that revelation of musical detail, the foot tapping aspect that made Paul Benson sit there tapping his knees to Dire Straits, that's all there. But at the same time, I hear what I didn't hear on the original 770, and that is that characteristic taken through to the frequency extremes, so that you're really aware of what every instrument is doing, what all the harmonics are doing, exactly how things are in the mix. In fact, I demonstrated it to one of our pro engineers. He's always working on revealing pro monitors. And I just sat him down and said, "What do you think?" And he said, first of all, he went over and he's put his ear to each loudspeaker. And then he came back and sat down. I said, "Why did you do that?" He said, "I couldn't believe that I couldn't hear the loudspeakers. I could just hear the mix. I didn't know, how do you do that?" So that, for me, that's exactly what I wanted. This is a monitor class loudspeaker that has the same characteristics as the 770, but does it in a way that you just hear into the music, hear what the performers are actually doing. That's what most excites me.
Well, that sounds amazing, and I'm sure it's going to whet the appetite of a lot of listeners out there to explore the new 770. Can you give us, just, I guess, as really the last question, do you know when the speaker is actually available and is in production? Can you give us any of those details?
Well, we're just going through pre-production now. By the way, it's important to say that we're making this at our new Huntingdon production facilities. We've got full production and test facilities now. So we're just doing a pre-production run to make sure that everything goes together the way that I want it to, and that the speakers sound exactly as the prototypes that I've got sitting here are sounding. By the way, we've also got some stands to go with them. These are specifically designed to get the best out of the 770. And we should be in production in January, so the speakers should be available first quarter of next year.
So, breaking news for our SoundStage viewers today: the 770 will be made in the UK, and thank you for reminding me that that's probably one of the most important aspects of the new design. Well, Peter, thank you so much for joining me today. Your experience with loudspeaker design and is just it's fascinating, to say the least. And I really appreciate the tour of the new 770. And man, I can't wait to hear a pair for myself. So thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
It's been a pleasure. It's been great talking to you.